The inventory listed everything: the silver candlesticks in the east drawing room, the Flemish tapestry on the second-floor landing, the wine cellar, 412 bottles, including a case of port that had been laid down before Sylvie was born, the oak dining table that had seated 30, the rose garden, the Dovecote, the old mill that no longer turned, the debts. It did not list Sylvie Crestham. She supposed that was something. You could not put a person on an inventory. You could not write one young woman, aged 22, of uncertain legal standing, formerly daughter of the house between the Flemish tapestry and the wine cellar. It wasn't done, and yet, standing in the kitchen doorway on the morning the new owner arrived, watching his carriage come up the long gravel drive through the October rain, Sylvie thought, that is more or less what has happened. Her father had sold Aldenmoor in March, 6 weeks before he died. She had not known until April, when the solicitor, a small dry man named Mr. Foss, had come to the house with papers and a careful face. Her father had debts she had not been told about. Her father had made decisions she had not been consulted on. Her father had, in the end, been a man she had known only in parts, and the parts she had not known had swallowed everything. Mr. Foss had been kind, in his careful way. He had explained that the estate passed to the new owner in full. He had explained that there was no provision made for her in any instrument he was able to locate. He had explained this was the part she kept returning to in the nights afterward, the part that felt most like a door swinging shut, that because she was not named in the entail, and because the estate had been sold rather than inherited, her position was, legally speaking, that of a guest in a house that was no longer anyone's obligation. She had asked what she should do. He had said that was not, strictly speaking, his area. She had stayed. There was nowhere else to go. She had a trunk of clothes, £60 in a savings account her mother had opened when Sylvie was 9, and the kind of education that taught you French irregular verbs and watercolor technique, but nothing whatsoever about what to do when the house your family had owned for 140 years was sold out from under you. She had stayed and helped Mrs. Dove in the kitchen and learned, in those months, how cold a house could feel when you no longer belonged to it, but could not bring yourself to leave. The carriage stopped. A man got out. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, the way he unfolded from the carriage in a way that suggested he was accustomed to spaces that were too small for him. Dark coat, hat pulled against the rain. He stood for a moment looking up at the facade of the house with an expression she could not read from the kitchen doorway, and then he walked toward the front entrance, and Mrs. Dove said, behind her, "You'll want to step back from there, Miss Sylvie." She stepped back. She had told Mrs. Dove weeks ago that she intended to stay on as a housemaid. Mrs. Dove had said nothing for a long moment, and then had said that was her choice to make. Sylvie had understood that Mrs. Dove was not going to argue her out of it, and was also not going to pretend she thought it was a sensible idea. The two of them had arrived at a kind of silent agreement. Sylvie would help in the mornings. She would take her meals in the kitchen, and she would not make things complicated. She had cut her hair shorter. She had borrowed a plain dress from Mrs. Dove's niece. She had become, in the space of 6 months, someone who moved quietly through a house and did not look directly at the family portraits when she passed them in the corridor. There was one portrait on the upper landing that she could not quite make herself avoid. It had been painted when she was 14, her mother already gone by then, her father standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder, in a way that looked fond but had, in the moment, felt formal. She was wearing a blue dress she had loved. She was smiling at something outside the frame. She passed it every morning, with her eyes fixed on the floor. The new owner's name was Gareth Wyndham, and he arrived with a manservant, a crate of books, and an attitude of efficient assessment that made Sylvie, watching from the servants' corridor, feel like a room being measured for new furniture. He was not what she had expected. She was not entirely sure what she had expected. Someone older, perhaps, or someone who wore his money more loudly. But he moved through the house on that first afternoon with a quietness she had not anticipated. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He stood for a long time in the library, looking at the shelves, and she had the unsettling sense, watching through the gap in the door, that he was not cataloging them but actually reading the spines. Mrs. Dove introduced the staff at 6 o'clock. There were only 4 of them now. Mrs. Dove herself, the groundskeeper Peel, a kitchen girl named Agnes, and Sylvie. Wyndham looked at each of them in turn when Mrs. Dove said their names. When he got to Sylvie, he looked at her for a moment longer. "Sylvie," he said, "what is your role here?" "General duties," she said. "Housemaid." He nodded and moved on, and that was all. But she noticed, later, when Mrs. Dove was explaining the household accounts, that he asked about her again. "The young woman," he said. "Sylvie. How long has she been here?" "Quite some time," Mrs. Dove said, which was true in the way that weather forecasts are true. Accurate without being helpful. "Does she have family nearby?" A pause. "Not close by, sir." "I see," he said, and the conversation moved on, and Sylvie, standing in the passage outside with a tea tray she was pretending to arrange, felt her heart do something complicated. She avoided him at first. It was not difficult. The house was large, and he spent his mornings in the library and his afternoons riding the property. And she had learned, in 6 months, every route through Aldenmoor that did not require passing through a room where someone might look at her too carefully. But Aldenmoor had a way of making things happen on its own schedule. She was in the gallery on the upper floor, dusting, which she had made a point of doing, because no one else would go up there, and she did not want anyone to look too closely at the portrait. When she heard his step on the stairs, she turned to face the window. Outside, the oaks were turning. The sky was the color of an old pewter dish. "You don't have to stop," he said from the doorway. She turned. He was looking at the portrait. She had thought, in the months of living with it, that she was accustomed to the portrait. The way her 14-year-old self stood in that blue dress, with that smile, aimed at something outside the frame. She had thought it was just a painting now. Just a painting in a house that no longer belonged to her family. But watching Gareth Wyndham look at it was different. He was looking at it the way he had looked at the bookshelves, not cataloging, but actually seeing. He turned to look at her. She held herself very still. "Who is she?" he said. "I don't know, sir. A previous family, I expect." He looked back at the portrait, then back at her. The silence stretched in a way that made her want to say something else, anything else, but she had learned, in these months, that sometimes the safest thing was to wait. "The resemblance," he said carefully, "is quite marked." "Yes," she said. "I've noticed that." She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the small room off the kitchen that had become hers, and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the way he had said, "The resemblance is quite marked." Not accusatory, not triumphant, just careful, as if he were turning a piece of evidence over and not yet sure what to do with it. She thought about her father, about the way he had never explained things until it was too late to do anything about them, about the letter Mr. Foss had given her at the end of that April meeting, a sealed envelope that her father had left with the solicitor, with instructions to give to Sylvie after his death. She had read it 4 times and then folded it back into its envelope and put it at the bottom of her trunk under the winter clothes. The letter said that he was sorry, that he had made errors of judgment that had compounded over years into a situation he could not reverse, that the estate had been sold because there was no other way to settle the debts without the scandal, destroying what little was left of the family name, that he knew she would not understand, perhaps could never understand, but that he wanted her to know she had always been, in every way that mattered to him, the truest thing in his life. It said, at the end, that he had left something for her. Not the estate, that was gone. But there was a letter, filed with the deed of sale, that acknowledged her as his legitimate daughter and natural heir to the family name. Not the property, just the name, just the acknowledgement. She had not known what to do with that, either. He found her in the kitchen garden 3 days later. She was cutting the last of the autumn herbs. Mrs. Dove believed in preserving thyme and rosemary until the cold actually arrived, not before. And she heard his step on the path and knew it was him before she turned. She had learned his footstep in the way you learned things at Aldenmoor, involuntarily, because the house was always listening, and eventually so were you. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "and I would appreciate it if you told me the truth." She kept cutting for a moment. Then she set down the knife. "What is your connection to this house?" he said. "Not your role, your connection." She looked at him. He was watching her with that same careful expression, not unkind, not suspicious, but very direct, as if he had decided that whatever the answer was, he preferred to have it. She said, "My father owned it." He said nothing. She said, "He sold it before he died. There was nowhere else to go. I thought if I stayed, perhaps." She stopped. The sentence did not have an ending she was willing to say out loud. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the rosemary and she smelled it, the way she had smelled it all her life. "What was his name?" Wyndham said. "Lord Crestham," she said. "The 4th Baron Crestham." He looked at the house, then back at her. "And you are?" "Sylvie Crestham." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, a bird was doing something noisy in the ivy. "I see," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. "And you've been here since March, since before he died." "I haven't. I know I have no claim here. I know that. She stopped again. "I only couldn't leave." He nodded slowly. "Come inside," he said. "I think there are some things we should discuss." They sat in the library because the library was the room where it felt most natural for serious conversations to happen, and because it was the room where she had spent most of her childhood, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind him knowing that. He had found the letter. Not her father's letter to her. That was still in the trunk. But the letter filed with the deed of sale, the one Mr. Foss had mentioned. He had been going through the legal documents with his own solicitor that week, a methodical man named Mr. Greaves. And Mr. Greaves had found it and flagged it and brought it to Wyndham that morning. He put it on the table between them. She recognized her father's handwriting on the outside. "I haven't opened it," he said. "It's addressed to no one, but I understand now that it was intended for whoever would find it. I'd like you to read it." She read it. It was longer than the letter in her trunk. It said what Mr. Foss had told her, that Sylvie was his legitimate daughter and acknowledged heir to the family name, but it also said more than that. It said that at the time of the sale, he had spoken to the buyer about the situation, but he could not guarantee that the buyer would honor any informal understanding. He wanted it written down. He wanted anyone who came to this house to know that there was a daughter, and her name was Sylvie Crestham, and she had done nothing to deserve what had happened to her. She folded the letter when she was done. Wyndham was watching her. "He loved you," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "in the way that people love things they've already decided to sacrifice." A beat of silence. She had not meant to say that out loud, but he did not flinch from it, which she noted. "The buyer he mentioned," Wyndham said. "The one he spoke to, that was not me. I purchased from an estate agent. There was an intermediary." "I know," she said. "You couldn't have known." "No." He looked at the letter. "But I know now." It was around that time that Aldous Finch arrived. Aldous Finch was her father's cousin, a fact she had grown up understanding the way you understand that some kitchen smells are appetizing and some are warning signs. He had contested every decision her father had made in the last 10 years of his life, and when the estate was sold, he had written a letter to Mr. Foss suggesting that the sale was invalid and the estate should have come to him under some obscure theory of entailment that Mr. Foss had politely described as incorrect. He arrived in a hired carriage with a solicitor she did not recognize and an expression she recognized entirely. The look of a man who has convinced himself he is owed something and is here to collect it. He did not know she was there. He came to the front door, he was shown into the drawing room, and he waited for Wyndham. She heard it from the passage. She was not eavesdropping, precisely. She was standing in the passage because it was the fastest route to the back stairs, and she had been on her way upstairs. But she heard it, and she stayed still and listened. Finch's argument was elaborate, but it reduced to one claim: that Sylvie Crestham, as an unmarried daughter, could not have been her father's legitimate heir anyway, so the estate should have passed through the male line, which was to say through him. He acknowledged the estate had been sold. He seemed to find this an inconvenience but not an obstacle. He was, it became clear, planning to contest the legality of the sale itself. She listened to Wyndham's response. He said, without any particular heat, "The sale is legal. I have had it reviewed. If you believe otherwise, I encourage you to pursue the matter in court, where the finding will be the same." Finch said something about the daughter. Wyndham said, "Miss Crestham is my concern, not yours." A pause. "Your concern," Finch repeated. "My household," Wyndham said. "My estate, my responsibility. Her position here is my affair." She stood in the passage and felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a clean word for. Not relief exactly. It was bigger than relief, and sharper, and it came with an aftertaste she recognized as the feeling you got when someone did something decent and you were not entirely sure you deserved it. Finch left. She went upstairs and stood in the gallery for a while, looking at the portrait. The girl in the blue dress was still smiling at something outside the frame. She had always wondered, as a child, what 14-year-old Sylvie had been looking at. She thought now it might have just been the light. She meant to thank him. She planned it in the methodical way she had planned things since March. Not impulsively, because impulse had not served her well, but with attention to what was actually appropriate, what could actually be said, what would not make things more complicated than they already were. She found him in the library, where he usually was at that hour. She had meant to keep it brief. She had planned something along the lines of, "I overheard your conversation with Mr. Finch, and I wanted to thank you for what you said." What she actually said was, "I know I cannot stay forever." She had not planned to say that. She watched Wyndham look up from his book with an expression she could not immediately name. "I know that my position here is unusual," she said. "I am not so far gone as to believe I can simply remain as a housemaid indefinitely without it becoming." She stopped. "I am trying to say that I understand the situation, and I am grateful for your patience with it, and I am not asking you to solve it for me," he said. "What are you asking?" "A few more weeks. To find a position somewhere. I have some savings. I thought perhaps a school. Governesses are always needed." "No," he said. She looked at him. "Not a governess position," he said, and there was something in his voice now that she was paying close attention to, because it was the voice he used when he was choosing his words very carefully. "I don't want you to take a governess position." She waited. He set his book down. "I want to propose something else," he said. "And I want to say at the start that you are entirely at liberty to refuse, and that if you refuse, nothing changes. You may stay as long as you need, and I will help you find a position that suits you, and that is the end of it. This is not a proposal you are required to accept." She was very still. "Then what kind of proposal is it?" she said. He looked at her across the table, across the old oak table that had been her father's, that was now his, that she had sat at as a child for Sunday luncheons and holiday dinners, and one very long afternoon when she was 11 and had been made to practice her letters while her father read correspondence beside her. "The honest kind," he said. "I have been thinking about this since I found the letter, since you told me your name." She did not say anything. "The house needs a mistress," he said. "That is true, and it is convenient to say, but it is not the real reason, and I don't want to dress it in convenience." He paused. "I have been alone for a long time in the way that is not about company, but about finding someone whose way of looking at the world you recognize. I have found that, here, in the last several weeks, unexpectedly, and I think you know that." She thought about the garden, the library, the way she had started listening for his step, not to avoid him, but because the sound of it had become, without her quite noticing, reassuring. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are proposing marriage." "I am." She looked at the window. The oaks were still turning. They would finish soon, and the branches would be bare, and the winter would come in over the fields the way it always had, the same way it had come in every year she could remember, the light changing, the mornings going quiet and cold. "This is my house," she said. She had not meant it as an accusation. She was not sure how she had meant it. "Yes," he said. "No, you know it was mine. And you're offering to. I'm offering to share it," he said, "which is not the same as giving it back. I know it's not the same, but it's what I have to offer." She thought about the portrait, about the girl in the blue dress, 14 years old, looking at something outside the frame, about the letter at the bottom of her trunk that said, "You have always been the truest thing in my life." She thought about her father, who had loved her in the way that people love things they've already decided to sacrifice. And she thought about the man sitting across from her, who had told a man like Aldous Finch that she was his concern, unprompted, with no benefit to himself. Those were not the same kind of love. She understood that. She was not entirely sure what they were yet, the thing between them. But she recognized it. She recognized it the way you recognized the smell of the house you grew up in, not consciously, not with analysis, but in the body, before the mind had a chance to argue. "I need a week," she said. "Take 2, he said. She took 4 days. They were married in November, in the small church on the edge of the property that her grandmother had restored, and her father had largely ignored. Mrs. Dove wore her good coat." Agnes cried. Peel stood in the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending a significant weather event. Afterward, standing in the entrance hall of Aldenmoor with the cold light coming in through the high windows, Sylvie looked at her husband. The word was still new, still slightly astonishing in the way that true things sometimes were, and then looked up at the staircase she had climbed 10,000 times. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the portrait." He followed her gaze. "I thought we should move it," she said. "It belongs down here." "In the entrance hall, where people see it when they come in." He considered this. "Where people see who belonged here," he said. "Yes." He nodded. "Then that's where it will go." She looked at the stairs. She looked at the entrance hall. She thought about all the routes she had learned through this house that avoided rooms where people might look at her too carefully. She thought about how she would not need those routes anymore. Outside, the oaks were bare now, all the autumn color finished, and the winter light was coming across the fields in long pale bars the way it always had, the way it had before she was born and would after she was gone. The same fields, the same light, the house standing at the end of the long drive exactly as it had always stood. She had come home. She had never left. The distance between those two things was what her life had been, these last 8 months, and standing here now she could feel how large that distance had been, and how it had finally closed. She put her hand through her husband's arm, and they walked upstairs, together, to move the portrait into the light.